The fog over the London docks was not merely a weather condition, it was a heavy, suffocating shroud, a thick blanket of grey that seemed to swallow the very soul of the city. Silas Thorne stood at the precipice of the pier, his tall, imposing silhouette cutting through the mist like a jagged blade. Silas was a man built of hard angles, bitter winters, and an even harder resolve. His skin, the color of deep, polished mahogany, was a testament to his lineage, though his clothes spoke of a different world entirely. His coat was of the finest midnight blue wool, his waistcoat embroidered with subtle silver thread, and his cravat was a masterpiece of blindingly white silk, knotted with clinical precision. He was the most formidable merchant king in all of England, a man who had built an empire from the dust, rising from the ashes of a past he had spent 2 decades trying to outrun. He had wealth that could buy entire provinces and power that could topple the most established banks, but he lacked the one thing the 10 demanded for a man of his standing, a wife to secure his legacy. But Silas Thorne was not interested in the giggling, pastel-clad debutantes of Mayfair. He had no patience for the strategic fluttering of fans, the practiced whispers of gossip in ballrooms, or the relentless, shallow pursuit of a title. He had seen the way those women looked at him, with a mixture of fear and calculated greed. He wanted a woman who would be a presence in his home without being a disturbance in his mind. He wanted a partner who would respect the walls he had built around his heart. He wanted silence. He believed that silence was the only way to keep his secrets buried where they belonged. So, when the rumors first reached him of the Earl of Ravenclaw's youngest daughter, a woman of rare, haunting beauty who had not uttered a single word since a mysterious tragedy 3 years ago, he saw not a misfortune, but a perfect opportunity. The Earl was a man drowning in gambling debts, his ancient family estate crumbling into the damp earth of the countryside. Silas offered a sum that was obscene, a golden lifeline that came with only one condition, the hand of the silent lady Amara. The day Silas first stepped into the decaying drawing-room of Ravenclaw Manor, the air smelled of damp wood, old paper, and fading glory. He had expected to find a frail, broken creature, a woman hollowed out by her trauma. Instead, he found Amara. She was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, the pale, filtered afternoon light catching the warmth of her amber skin, making her glow like a precious gemstone set in a ring of coal. Her hair was a magnificent, wild crown of tight, dark curls that framed a face of haunting perfection. When she turned to look at him, her eyes, large, dark, and filled with an intelligence that felt like a physical weight, met his without a hint of the fear he was accustomed to seeing. There was a quiet defiance in her posture, a queenly grace that made the air in Silas's lungs suddenly feel too thin. He had come to buy a silent object, a decorative addition to his household, but he realized in that heartbeat that he had encountered a force of nature. As the marriage contract was laid out on the scarred, dusty mahogany table, Silas found himself unable to look away from her. The tension in the room was a living thing, a silver wire stretched to the absolute point of snapping. He moved closer to the table to sign his name, his hand accidentally brushing against hers as he reached for the quill. The contact was like a lightning strike in a clear sky. A jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity surged through his arm, making his heart hammer against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, her pupils dilated until her eyes were twin pools of midnight, and he saw the small, frantic pulse at the base of her throat, the only sign that she was as affected as he was. She smelled of sandalwood, rain, and something ancient. He signed the papers with a hand that he forced to remain steady, but his mind was a storm. He had paid for her silence to ensure his own peace, but as she looked at him, he felt the first stirrings of a hunger that promised anything but tranquility. The Earl, her father, didn't even look at her as the deal was sealed. He only looked at the bank draft in his trembling hands. Amara remained a statue of amber and silk, her silence so profound it seemed to echo. Silas felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't anticipated. He wanted to usher her out of this dying house, away from the man who had sold her like a piece of furniture. But as he led her to his carriage, he realized he was just as guilty. He had bought her. He had exploited her silence for his own comfort. This realization bit into him, a sharp contrast to the heat her proximity generated. As the carriage door closed, sealing them in the small, plush space, Silas knew that his life of cold logic had just come to a violent end. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of questions, desires, and a hidden history that was already beginning to scream. The journey from the decaying ruins of Ravenclaw Manor to the sprawling, obsidian stone Thorn estate was a voyage through a landscape of shadows and rising heat. Inside the luxury of the private carriage, the air was dense, almost heavy enough to be felt against the skin. Silas sat opposite his new bride, his long legs angled to avoid the cream-colored silk of her skirts, though every jolt of the carriage threatened to bring them into contact. He was a man who prided himself on his ironclad control, a man who had navigated the cutthroat world of London commerce without ever losing his footing. Yet, in the presence of Amara's absolute silence, he felt as though he were walking a tightrope over an abyss. He watched her through hooded eyes, observing the way the flickering light of the carriage lamps danced across her amber skin. She was looking out the window, her profile a study in regal stoicism. He found himself wondering what lay beneath that calm exterior. Was she screaming inside? Was she grieving the life she had lost, or was she simply hollowed out by the tragedy that had stolen her voice? Silas felt a strange, nagging guilt. He had intended this arrangement to be cold and clinical, a transaction of gold for a legacy, but the physical magnetism between them was making a mockery of his plans. Every time she shifted, every time the scent of sandalwood reached his senses, his pulse quickened. He wanted to reach out and touch her, to see if she was as warm as she looked, or if the fire in his own veins was enough for both of them. Silence, Silas was beginning to realize, was not the absence of sound, it was a powerful, evocative presence. Amara spoke with the tilt of her head, the slight furrow of her brow, and the way her fingers occasionally traced the embroidery on her velvet cloak. She was a mystery he couldn't solve with a balance sheet or a business contract. He caught himself imagining the sound of her voice. Would it be a low, melodic hum, or a sharp, crystalline ring? The irony was not lost on him. He had paid for a bride who could not speak so that he wouldn't have to share his own secrets, yet her very silence seemed to be demanding that he reveal everything. He felt an inexplicable urge to tell her things he had never told anyone, about the hunger of his youth, the coldness of his rise to power, and the ghosts that still haunted the corridors of his mind. As the carriage finally turned into the long, winding drive of his estate, the massive house loomed ahead like a fortress of dark glass and silver stone. This was the monument to his success, the proof that the boy who had once had nothing was now a king in his own right. But as he looked at Amara, he saw no awe in her expression, only a quiet, knowing recognition that unsettled him further. He stepped out of the carriage first, offering his hand to help her down. As her small, gloved hand came to rest in his large, dark palm, a jolt of electricity, stronger and more intimate than before, raced through him. He felt the delicate strength of her grip, the warmth that seemed to seep through the fabric, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw her eyes soften. The entrance hall of Thorn Estate was vast, filled with the echoes of their footsteps on the polished marble. The servants stood in a perfect, silent line, bowing as their new mistress passed. Silas led her up the grand staircase, his heart thumping a heavy rhythm against his ribs. The tension that had been a low hum in the carriage was now a deafening roar. They reached the doors of the master suite, a sanctuary of deep blues and rich golds, where a fire already crackled in the hearth, casting long, predatory shadows across the walls. This was the moment where the transaction became a marriage. Silas turned to her, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. He had bought a silent bride to ensure his peace, but as he closed the door behind them, he knew that peace was the last thing he would find in her arms. The first dinner at Thorn Estate was a masterclass in unspoken intensity. They sat at opposite ends of a long, obsidian dark table, the silver candelabras casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance to the rhythm of Silas's racing heart. The only sounds were the soft clink of crystal against china and the crackle of the fireplace behind them. Silas watched Amara over the rim of his wineglass. She ate with a delicate precision, her every movement radiating a calm that he found increasingly unnerving. He was a man who lived by words, negotiations, contracts, commands, but here, in the presence of his silent wife, his words felt clumsy and unnecessary. The silence wasn't a void, it was a conversation he didn't know how to join. He found himself mesmerized by the way the candlelight caught the amber glow of her skin and the way her long, dark lashes brushed her cheeks when she looked down. The sexual tension was no longer a hum, it was a physical weight, pressing against his chest, making every breath a conscious effort. When the meal was over, the silence followed them up the grand staircase. Silas felt a strange, primal urge to sweep her into his arms and carry her the rest of the way, to break the formal distance that the marriage contract had established. Instead, he led her to the master suite, the air between them thick with the scent of sandalwood and the heavy anticipation of the night ahead. As the heavy oak doors closed behind them, the world outside ceased to exist. There were no more servants, no more ledgers, no more London society. There was only the firelight, the massive bed with its deep blue velvet hangings, and the woman he had bought but did not know. Amara stood by the hearth, the orange flames casting a golden aura around her silhouette. Silas began to discard his formal evening wear, his movements slow and deliberate. He watched her reflection in the tall gilded mirror, seeing the way her chest rose and fell in a rhythmic, shallow cadence. He approached her, his footsteps silent on the thick rugs, until he was standing directly behind her. The heat radiating from her body was a magnetic pull he could no longer resist. He reached out, his dark hands hovering just inches from her amber shoulders, before finally making contact. Her skin was like heated silk, and he felt a violent tremor run through her at his touch. He began to unlace her gown, his fingers trembling with a mix of hunger and a strange, burgeoning tenderness. As the silk dress fell to the floor, leaving her in only a thin, translucent chemise, Silas turned her around to face him. The sight of her, half shadow, half firelight, was more beautiful than anything he had ever seen in his life. He trailed his fingers down the line of her jaw, his thumb lingering on her bottom lip. "I thought I wanted your silence, Amara," he whispered, his voice thick with a desire that bordered on pain. "But it's becoming my torment. I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know who you are behind those eyes." He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her skin, inhaling the intoxicating scent of her. He felt her hands reach up to his chest, her palms pressing against the frantic thrum of his heart. He moved to kiss her, a slow, deep claim that he had been starving for since their first meeting. But just as his lips were about to touch hers, he felt her stiffen. She didn't pull away, but she leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear. The world seemed to hold its breath. The fire popped in the hearth, a log settling into the embers, but Silas heard nothing but the rush of blood in his ears. And then, it happened. A sound so soft it was almost a thought, a name that shattered the foundation of his reality. "Kaylin," she breathed. The name was a ghost, a relic of a life that had been burned to ashes 20 years ago. Silas froze, his entire body turning to stone. The heat in his blood vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp dread that pierced his very soul. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of terror and a sudden, dangerous fury. Kaylin was not the name of the man the world knew as Silas Thorne. Kaylin was the name of a dead boy. He looked at the woman he had just been ready to surrender to, and for the first time, he saw not a bride, but a threat to everything he had built. "How?" he rasped, his voice a broken shard of glass. "How do you know that name?" The air in the room, which moments ago had been thick with the heat of unbridled passion, suddenly felt as cold as a tomb. Silas's hands, still resting on Amara's waist, tightened, not with affection, but with a desperate, defensive reflex. He felt as though the floor had vanished beneath his boots. The name she had whispered, Kaelin, was a ghost he had spent 20 years trying to lay to rest. It was the name of a boy who had watched his world burn, a boy who had been hunted by faceless men until he had reinvented himself as the iron-willed Silas Thorne. To hear it now, from the lips of the woman he had bought for her silence, was a betrayal that struck deeper than any blade. "How?" Silas repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibration that seemed to rattle the very crystals of the chandelier. He stepped back, pulling away from her warmth as if she were made of the same flames that had claimed his childhood. "Who are you working for? Was this the Earl's plan? To find my weakness and bleed me dry with it?" His mind raced through a list of enemies, rival merchants, vengeful lords, anyone who could have unearthed the truth of his identity. He looked at Amara, and for the first time, he didn't see a fragile bride. He saw a predator who had lured him into a trap of his own making. Amara didn't flinch at his fury. She stood her ground, the thin silk of her chemise fluttering in the draught from the fireplace. Her silence remained, but her eyes were no longer passive, they were burning with a fierce, ancient recognition. Slowly, she reached out toward him, but Silas recoiled. "Don't touch me," he hissed. "I paid for a silent bride, not a spy who whispers the names of the dead." He felt a violent conflict within him, the urge to cast her out of his house and the inexplicable, maddening desire to pull her back into his arms. The sexual tension had turned into a toxic brew of suspicion and longing. Instead of speaking again, Amara walked toward her small, velvet-lined travel trunk. Her movements were deliberate, filled with a gravity that demanded his attention. Silas watched her, his muscles tensed, ready for a weapon or a confession. But she didn't pull out a knife. She reached into the very bottom of the trunk and withdrew a small, scorched piece of wood. She walked back to him and held it out in her open palm. Silas stared at the object, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. It was a small, hand-carved wooden lion, half-blackened by soot. It was a toy he had dropped in the garden of his family estate the night the men with torches had come. His heart began to thud against his ribs, a slow, painful rhythm. He looked from the toy to Amara's face, searching for the truth in the contours of her amber skin. "I thought everyone died," he whispered, the iron mask of Silas Thorne finally cracking. "I thought I was the only one who made it out." Amara shook her head slowly, a single tear escaping and tracking a path through the golden light. She reached for his hand, and this time, he let her take it. She pressed his palm against the small, jagged scar just above her own collarbone, a burn mark that mirrored the one he carried on his shoulder. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. She hadn't been a stranger he purchased. She had been the girl in the shadows, the daughter of the woman who had hidden him in the cellar while the house collapsed above them. Amara wasn't a spy, she was his fellow survivor. She had been silent not because she was broken, but because the truth was a fire that would have consumed them both if she had spoken it too soon. The weight of 20 years of shared, silent history crashed down upon them, transforming the cold room into a sanctuary of two souls finally finding their way back to the light. The weight of 20 years of silence seemed to evaporate in the heat of the flickering fireplace. Silas looked at the scorched wooden lion in his hand, then back at Amara, whose dark eyes were now brimming with a lifetime of unshed tears. The merchant king, the man of iron and ice, felt his knees grow weak. He wasn't just Silas Thorne, the wealthiest man in London. He was Kalen, the boy who had survived the unthinkable, and he was no longer alone. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the amber skin of her cheek, tracing the path of a single, silent tear. "All this time," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the night of the fire. "I thought I was a ghost haunting my own life. But you are the living proof that I existed." Amara took a step closer, her hand rising to cover his. "I never stopped looking for you, Kalen," she said, her voice growing stronger, a beautiful, velvet melody that filled the hollow spaces of the room. "The silence was my shield, but it was also my prison. I waited until you were powerful enough, until I could find a way to reach you without leading our enemies to your door." The revelation of her sacrifice, of the years she spent pretending to be broken just to protect the secret of his survival, shattered the last of Silas's defenses. The protective wall he had built around his heart didn't just crumble, it turned to ash. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest in an embrace that was desperate, primal, and profoundly tender. The sexual tension that had simmered between them since the London docks finally boiled over, but it was no longer fueled by mystery or suspicion. It was fueled by a soul-deep recognition. Silas kissed her with a ferocity that spoke of 2 decades of suppressed longing, and Amara met his passion with a boldness that took his breath away. As they moved toward the massive bed, the silence of the night was replaced by the language of their bodies, a symphony of whispered names and shared breath. Every touch was a reclamation of what had been stolen from them. Silas worshipped every inch of her amber skin, his dark hands exploring her curves with a reverence that made Amara moan his true name over and over again into the hollow of his neck. In the sanctuary of their marriage bed, the merchant and the silent bride ceased to exist. They were Kalen and Amara, 2 flames that had survived the storm, finally merging into one. The intimacy was explosive, a desperate and beautiful dance of survival and surrender. Silas found peace in her arms, a sense of belonging that no amount of gold could ever buy. As the fire in the hearth turned to glowing embers, they lay tangled together in the silk sheets, the dawnlight beginning to bleed through the curtains in shades of soft rose and violet. For the first time in his life, Silas Thorne didn't wake up reaching for his armor, he woke up reaching for the woman who had given him back his soul. The world outside would still be dangerous. There were still enemies to face and a legacy to build, but they would face it together. Amara had found her voice, and Silas had found his truth. As he watched her sleep, her dark curls spilled across the pillow, he realized that the price he had paid for a silent bride was the best investment of his life, not because of her silence, but because she was the only one who truly knew the man behind the mask. He leaned down, whispering a promise against her forehead that only she would ever hear. The silence was broken, but their story was just beginning, written in the language of a love that had been forged in the fire and would never, ever be extinguished. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means the world.